A strong preference is to do zero classes September, October, November, and freak out December and January.
Welcome to The Extra Dimension, the show where we explore ways technology intersects with other parts of our lives, which we like to call the technological convergence. I am your host, Ian R. Buck, and goodness gracious, it has been a long time since I got to say that intro. Today we'll be talking about distance learning, and ironically, distance learning itself is the reason that we have not had a new episode of this show in almost a year. So, if you'll recall, the last episode was all about working from home because many of us had transitioned to, working from home environment during the pandemic. And my next episode was going to be all about education during the pandemic. And I recorded a bunch of interviews with fellow teachers, with administration, a few parents, and I had all those ready to go, but then the new school year hit me in the face like a brick wall, and so I was never able to edit them into an episode, which means that I've got a bunch of, many hours of interviews, but most of them are not really as relevant now. So I won't be including a whole lot of those in this episode, but if you do want to hear a snapshot of how people were feeling at the time, in August of 2020, I've put the full unedited versions of those interviews in the fringe of this episode. So you can find a link to the fringe as well as all of the show notes for this episode of The Extra Dimension at thenexus.tv/TED56. All right, so we all know that the pandemic is what pushed us into distance learning, and now in the summer of 2021, it seems like we are going to be at a point in the fall where, at least in the United States, where we'll be able to go back in person, and the pandemic will not be too much of a concern. But that's not what we're here to talk about in this episode. So in this episode, we're just going to talk about the experience of distance learning itself. What are the challenges? What went well? What lessons can we carry forward into the future of education? So we'll be talking about distance learning regardless of what kinds of extenuating circumstances there may be that would force us into distance learning. Or if we just decide to, use a distance learning model on a day-to-day basis anyway. Speaking of using a distance model on a day-to-day basis, one of the interviews that I conducted last summer was with a former housemate of mine, Peter Westby, who works as a teacher at the Minnesota Online High School, which, as the name implies, is an entire school that is all online and always has been. And so I was really, really eager to pick his brains and learn about what kinds of things does the Minnesota Online High School do differently than other in-person schools, and what models do they use and everything. So let's actually hear a little bit from that interview, because that stuff definitely still applies, and we can definitely compare his experiences to what the rest of us went through as we transitioned into distance learning.
My name is Peter Westby, and I'm a instructional coach with Minnesota Virtual Schools. I started out as a social studies teacher, and I've been doing this role now this is going to be my second year going in. I work with teachers one-on-one to help them develop their courses. My specialty is in the Moodle framework as a platform. So Minnesota Virtual School has been kind of its standalone school for about 10, 12 years. I'm not exactly sure the exact start date. It's taken in a couple different iterations. And I want to say it was about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, that they came under the wing of being part of the MTS district. So now we are not a standalone school as a virtual school. We work within a larger district of 7 different schools, 2 of which are online schools all the time. Anyway, like Minnesota Virtual and Connections Academy is the other one. I phrase it to a lot of our staff is that we're not necessarily anyone's first choice. For students that have really busy schedules because they're in junior Olympics or semi-professional sports programs, we're kind of a first choice school. Otherwise, students are usually coming to us because something hasn't worked out in their local school district, right? So a lot of that population is either from Minneapolis public schools, from St. Paul public schools, a lot in the western suburbs as well, so like Eden Prairie, Wayzata, Maple Grove. And then we have students from all across the state. A lot of what it will attract them to us is that something hasn't been working at their regular school, whether it's that they have a serious disconnect with teachers. A lot of the times it's they're trying to pick up a work schedule because they need to support their family one way or another, and they just need a more flexible school schedule. They can't sit in a classroom 8 to 3 because those are prime working hours for a lot of job places. And then you do get a fair amount of students that are in due to various bullying or mental health situations that have suffered severe anxiety in the classroom. And we have a lot of LGBTQ plus members or students in our school where they've been bullied or they're going through a tough time, say like transitioning and looking to kind of help get some more support in their transition than they would at their regular school district, especially as you get them further out state where that may be more frowned upon than in the Twin Cities. So we get a little bit of a grab bag of everything. So the nice thing about working online, especially at our school, is we kind of write our own schedules. So we're in a setting where there are two forms of online teaching. Basically, it's synchronous or asynchronous. Synchronous being you're trying to emulate the classroom environment as much as possible. You have a student log in at a specific time to like a Zoom call, or I think Skype was more commonly used more when this started. Everyone sits in the Skype call together and you go through a 45-50 minute lesson. Our middle school is kind of built that way. But for the most of the high school, we've preloaded all the curriculum. By day one, the whole class is in Moodle, ready to go, which makes curriculum development a little bit tricky because you're always trying to do it a semester ahead, basically. And the students just access it as they're available. And we have some kind of minimum expectations. We communicate with them and the families on at least weekly basis of, hey, this is what you've gotten done this week. This is what you should have gotten done this week. Good job. Or let's see if we can, get a teacher to reach out to you, figure out what's going on. How do we get you more on track, more on pace? So I have had students in the past where they decide to do, just one class at a time because that works best for them instead of their full load of 6. And so I have kids that get done with my economics class by the time like October starts.
Is there a strong preference one way or the other among your student population?
A strong preference is to do 0 classes September, October, November, and freak out December and January. Most of our students will choose to do all classes at once. We strongly recommend they do that. It's going to lead to basically less gaps in learning. We already see in traditional education, summer's kind of this black hole of knowledge. And so if you start to emulate those things across a school year, then you're really going to have issues by the time that, if you do all your math in September, by the time you might get math again next September, you're going to be in a really rough shape.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Peter.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the models that we used at Harding High School, at least. Most of what I'm going to talk about here in this episode is going to be from my personal experiences and what I have observed from, talking with my coworkers at Harding specifically. So, yeah, throughout the whole distance learning period, we went through several different models, but there were a couple of things that were consistent throughout the whole thing. So number one, teachers were always expected to chunk out their classes into week-long folders, and they would publish those folders on Schoology every Monday morning. For me personally, this was the main reason that this school year was so much work for me, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Also, throughout the whole thing, students who were remote were responsible for marking themselves as present in Infinite Campus. That's the system that we use for our attendance tracking. So this was inherently disconnected from like whether or not those students came to like a live Google Meet or anything like that. As long as they logged into campus and marked themselves as present, then they were marked as present for that day, whether they did any work or not. Which is kind of similar to how it works in the actual school building, right? You can totally come to class and then never do anything, and you still get marked as present because you're there. But that does mean that it took me quite a while longer to learn most of my students' names because I wasn't, doing roll call every single day. Also, there was a much larger emphasis on the advisory teachers forging relationships with their students and the families of those students to kind of help them keep on track with all of the work that they needed to be doing. A lot of the advisory periods ended up being, well, I don't know this for sure because I don't have an advisory class, but what it looked like on the schedule was a lot of the advisory time was meant so that the students could kind of look over all of the folders that they had, that their teachers from all their classes had published for them, and plan out, which pieces of work did they need to prioritize first, and when were they going to try and get everything done, et cetera, and so their advisory teacher could kind of help out with that. So during fourth quarter of the 2019 to 2020 school year, so this was right after, well, in SPPS, we were out of school for a while before the pandemic hit Minnesota because we were in the middle of a teacher strike as well. So there were like 3 weeks even before Minnesota closed everything down, where we weren't in the classroom in the first place. So fourth quarter, though, we came back to doing virtual school, distance learning. So everything was virtual at that point. And initially, for the end of that school year, St. Paul Public Schools was directing teachers to not have synchronous classes at all, right? So we didn't have a scheduled time where our students were expected to come to a video call and interact with their teachers and the rest of their class live. But the teachers were offering office hours, right? So I would just hang out in a Google Meet, and students could drop into that call whenever they needed to, if they had questions or were having problems. But all of the work that they were doing was just like I would put instructions up in the weekly folder, and students would open that and read them and do whatever activities and assignments were in there, and then they would come to my office hours if they needed any help. Fast forward to fall semester of 2020 to 2021, SPPS changed things up a little bit. So at that point, we were having synchronous classes 4 days a week, and then we would also have one day a week would be an asynchronous day, and then we had we had office hours pretty much every day, I think. Every day of the week for at least an hour, I think, was what all of the teachers were expected to do. Third quarter of 2020 to 2021, they introduced this iPass model, which was, at that point, some teachers had the chance to get vaccinated, and the school board, I think, was feeling pressure from parents to get students back into the classroom and stuff. So they introduced this thing called iPass, which wasn't in-person classes. It wasn't a hybrid model. It wasn't all virtual. It was a select population of students could sign up to be a part of the iPass program. So they were prioritizing students, like English language learner students, special ed, and also any students who, usually had passing grades, but during distance learning, may have been falling behind. Those students could sign up to come into the building 2 days a week, but they weren't like having classes. They were sitting in a room with a couple of teachers who were there to assist if they needed anything. But it was basically just quiet work time for these students, which I think was a really positive thing for a lot of these students because, as we'll talk about in a bit, a lot of the challenges that came from distance learning just came down to a lot of students, like their home environment is not conducive to doing schoolwork all day. But other than that, other than iPass, we still had synchronous classes 4 days a week, and 1 day was asynchronous. And then we did have to reduce the number of office hours that we were offering because all of the teachers had to come in a couple of days a week to help facilitate iPass. And then in fourth quarter of 2020, 2021, we fully brought back in-person classes 4 days a week, but students were still able to opt for staying remote. And I know that, my classes were less than half full for the most part. You can tell that there were a lot of families who were still nervous about sending their kids back to the classrooms. And even while we were there in the classrooms with with half of our students, we were also as teachers expected to serve our in-person students and our remote students equally well. And so I know that some of my colleagues tried to kind of go back to doing their lectures in front of the class, doing activities in class, but also like having a Google Meet open where all of their remote students were there, and they would, I guess, try to pay attention to to what the students were saying in the chat in the Google Meet, as well as paying attention to like any questions that their students in the classroom had. And I decided, I wasn't going to be able to serve both of those groups equally well in that kind of model. So in order to serve everybody, what I did was I just continued to put all of my lessons and all of the activities up in Schoology as like video lessons, right? And so all of my students, whether they were in the classroom or whether they were at home, they would access those lessons on Schoology. They would do that work, and then the students at home could come to my office hours if they had questions, and the students who were in the classroom with me could just ask me while we were in class. So my classes ended up just being like quiet work time pretty much every day, where my students could ask me specific questions if they needed help. One thing that a lot of people seem to be very concerned with, and one of the arguments for going back into in-person learning as soon as possible, is that we didn't want our students to miss out on a whole school year, right? We didn't want them to fall behind from where they should be at in their curriculums. I don't think that is a particularly important thing to talk about because we've seen student populations in other adverse situations, such as students in the New Orleans area when Hurricane Katrina devastated that whole area, and they missed out on pretty much a whole school year worth of content. And while those students did fall behind from where they would have been at compared to their peers in other parts of the country initially, they very quickly catch up. So I'm not too worried personally about our students missing some critical part of their math curriculum or whatever. They will catch up. Don't worry about that. But we did see some reports about the proportion of students who were receiving failing grades during distance learning being significantly higher than students who were failing when we were all in person before. It is difficult to compare those things because I think partially in response to these concerns, St. Paul Public Schools did kind of change. We relaxed our grading scales a little bit. So at Harding, at least, it became like you had to get 50% in your classes or more in order to pass instead of 60%. And then also all of the D's and C's that any students may have earned, right? Those became P's, so just P for passing. But then any A's or B's that they earned would remain as A's and B's. And the reason that admin did that was because, if a student was doing really well, they wanted that to be reflected in the GPA. But if they, barely scraped by, but were held back because of these unforeseen circumstances, they didn't want that they didn't want their GPA to be punished for that reason. But yeah, I tried looking at some of my numbers in my personal classes, and it's a little bit difficult for me to compare because, as it turns out, when I look at old courses in Schoology, any of the students who have graduated are no longer in the Schoology system. Their accounts just get deleted, I guess. So I can't see what grades they got 4 years ago. All of the students are just it's a course with no students in it because all of those students have graduated. But from what I can tell of comparing, classes from this last school year to classes in the last 2 school years that still have most of the students in those classes listed in Schoology, my classes went from having roughly half of the students passing to having usually a third to half of the students passing. So it was noticeably lower, but it wasn't catastrophically lower. The thing that I did notice is that during distance learning, most of my students either never turned in any work whatsoever and thus, of course, failed, or they were totally on top of the ball game and got an A or a B. So it really there was very little middle ground between those two extremes. And I do wonder how much of that just comes down to the fact that I'm teaching elective classes, right? So some of the students who could handle some workload but not a full workload during distance learning, they may have been focusing on their core classes, and rightfully so. I totally get it. Computer tech, you don't need that as long as you have a tech credit sometime in the 4 years that you take that you're in high school. That is all that you need in order to graduate. But for English and math, you need all 4 years of those to graduate. So I don't blame any of my students, for prioritizing things that way. All right, let's briefly touch on the digital divide because, of course, yes, distance learning is a scenario where the problems of the digital divide really come into play. So in order for distance learning to be successful, it is imperative that your school not only be a one-to-one school, right, where they have a computer that they have given to each student, but also those schools need to be able to provide internet access to students who don't have it at home already, or who have, internet access that isn't fast enough, right? So at SPPS, we already had, a one-to-one program with the school iPads. Now, they did have to scramble a little bit in third quarter of 2019-2020 because there was a shortage of hotspots. They did have some hotspots to distribute to families, but they didn't have enough for all of the families that requested them. So there was kind of a waiting time while SPPS ordered more of those. But on the whole, I think SPPS had most of the physical infrastructure in place already to make this work. However, a lot of the district's poor software decisions held us back at the beginning. So, for example, before the pandemic, right, SPPS, we have Google accounts for all of the staff and all of the students, right? Which is great, because we can use Google Docs and Google Drive and, all those collaborative tools very effectively. But there are a few Google products that SPPS administration had disabled intentionally, right? So Hangouts was one of those, which I was kind of shocked by when I first started working at SPPS, and I had to do a few projects where I was collaborating with teachers from other buildings, and we were trying to figure out what platform we could all hop onto a video call together so we could talk about what we were working on. And that's when I discovered that Hangouts doesn't work on SPPS accounts. So before the pandemic, even SPPS teachers didn't have a way of video calling each other, short of using their own outside of the district accounts and systems to do that. Now, as soon as we started teaching from home, they activated Google Meet, which also, to be fair, Google Meet wasn't really yet ready for everything that we were going to throw at it. It didn't have really feature parity with Zoom. Zoom was very well positioned at the beginning of this pandemic to serve a lot of what people needed all of a sudden. But over the course of the next few months, Google Meet added a lot of features, and so by fall of 2020, it was a very, very useful tool, and could do pretty much everything that we needed to in order to manage our classes online. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the episode as well. Now, cybersecurity is a big aspect of schools being ready for distance learning. And let's be honest, cybersecurity is not something that school districts have excelled at in the past. How about those printers, Ryan? So, this is the kind of thing that, both school districts and also the tech companies that they contract with, are going to need to really focus on making sure that they are getting all of this right going forward, so that because there's a lot of sensitive information about our students, all of their class records and their grades and everything and whatnot, that only the families of those students are supposed to have access to that stuff. So, cybersecurity, something that I think schools are going to have to put more resources into to make sure that they are doing that well. Now, I didn't hear anything, over the last year about any school districts getting hit with major breaches or anything like that. But that doesn't mean that it can't happen in the future. Now, how prepared were the families for this? There were a lot of challenges, I think, that families faced during all of this. One thing is that, students suddenly needed a dedicated space to do all of their work at home. Not everybody had that kind of setup. If you've got a few kids in the house who only need to do homework for a couple of hours in the evenings, right, it's pretty reasonable for them to just do that at the dining room table or something. But if everybody's at home all the time, then it suddenly becomes much more important for everybody to have their own space. And I know that not all families were able to accommodate that in their home situation. Here in St. Paul, the city actually reached out to an organization called the Tool Library to have them just quickly build 600 desks for St. Paul students, which is a pretty awesome program. But even so, you can't just build 3 new rooms in a home in order for everybody to have like their own dedicated office space. So yeah, families that have lots of kids were hardest hit, I would say. Because yeah, like I had several students, like when they came to my office hours, and when they unmuted themselves to ask me whatever questions they had, like I could barely hear myself think over all of like the background noise from especially students who, because I teach high schoolers, but you know those students who had like younger siblings who are still in like elementary school or preschool or whatever, right? You know, they're pretty loud, so that's not a great environment for trying to get your own work done, especially if you are expected to like help provide childcare in your house. And that's something I think that was a little bit specific to, you know, the pandemic situation because everybody was home. But you know, going forward, it seems likely that, you know, most of our elementary school students, probably junior high students, right, will be like in person learning environments. But you know, I noticed that a lot of high schoolers are independent enough that, you know, distance learning might work better for them. And so in that situation, then, you know, if all the other kids are out of the house, I can totally see like a high schooler being able to be really successful doing their work from home. Now, how prepared were the teachers? Well, some of us were, you know, very prepared in the sense that we already had all of our materials digitally, right? And, you know, we were already everybody was supposed to be using Schoology as much as possible. And I mean, me as a computer tech teacher, of course, you know that I was definitely only distributing stuff to my students digitally. I mean, literally, like at the beginning of my classes, I often say to my students, like, welcome to computer tech. If I end up handing you a piece of paper sometime during this school year, then I have failed you as a computer tech teacher. And that was doubly true during distance learning. But for like teachers who have, you know, for example, classroom sets of books that they needed to distribute to their students, that was, you know, an added logistical challenge. And the school had to figure out how to get those materials to students at home. I have absolutely no idea how teachers that were doing like pottery classes or auto tech or, you know, things where it's like, wow, very specific specialized equipment that students are only going to have access to if they are at school. I have no idea how those teachers did their classes during distance learning. But yeah, for me personally, I could have coasted by just, you know, distributing all of the written materials that I already had for my students that I had always given out. But I did start to realize that a lot of the written materials, both stuff that I myself wrote, but also stuff that was from like curricula that I had bought. A lot of times, written materials that are kind of guiding you through how to do a particular thing on a computer are a little bit confusing, right? It's not always clear like where on the screen you're supposed to look to find whatever button it is that you're supposed to push. And that wasn't really a problem before when we were all in the classroom together because like a student who was confused could just raise their hand and I would walk over and in 5 seconds I could like point out where on the screen they're supposed to click. But when we're all at home, if a student gets confused, then they have to figure out, okay, when is Mr. Buck's office hours? When can I join a call with him to ask him this question? And then when they do ask the question, they have to then like screen share with me so that I can see what they're working on. And then I have to describe where on the screen they have to click and yada, yada, yada. So yeah, I decided that it would be a good idea for me to make video tutorials out of most of my lessons. So that's where a lot of my energy went over the last school year, was producing video versions of most of the activities. The other place where a lot of my energy went was just like having to rechunk all of my classes into week-long segments, because what I was used to doing before we started doing distance learning was just like, okay, I am going to put whatever assignment up on Schoology, and I set a due date because I know that this one is going to take us about a week and a half. And so then a week and a half later, when we finish with that assignment, then I put the next assignment up on Schoology, and then my students start working on that one instead. And when we're expected to have everything that a student is going to need for the entire week uploaded and ready for them to look at on Monday morning, then that means that I have to start thinking about the entire semester all as a whole, and I need to create all of my folders 2 weeks in advance and schedule all of this stuff to publish on the correct day and everything. And then if there's something that spans multiple weeks, then I have to move it from one folder to the next when we get to that new week. And it was yeah, that was a huge part of the work that I did this last school year, was just rechunking my my curricula into week-long segments, which was it was useful for my students, I think, because then they had documents, each folder had a document that explains what all of the assignments are in one place. But it did hold me back from being able to keep on top of grading everything in a timely manner, and being able to do other work outside of class, like making podcast episodes. So yeah, that is something that if I continue having to chunk everything out into week-long segments, that is something that I'll definitely make an effort to get done during the summer before the school year even starts, so that I don't have to worry about that during the school year. All right, let's talk about classroom management on video calls. So Google Meet is the platform that at SPPS we were using, and it makes perfect sense because we already have the Google Suite available to us, and that allows us to all of the teacher accounts are able to have different sets of permissions than the student accounts, so it's a very good system for that already. So for example, teachers can start a Google Meet call. Students cannot start one on their own. They can join an already existing call that a teacher has created, but they can't just hop into a call on their own with their friends, right? And Google Meet also has a lot of tools that allows teachers to mute students, or allowing them to post in the chat or not, all kinds of stuff like that. Screen sharing or no screen sharing, right? Those are all tools. Those are all settings that the teachers get within that Google Meet call. Also, we were able to create calls not just based on links that somebody has to click on, but also we can just create calls based on a nickname, right? You can create a call using a code that you make up, right? So all of my my first hour programming classes were always IRB programming 1, right? IRB being my initials, programming being which topic it is, and then 1 being what class period it was. And so then all of my students could type in that code and join the call. And as long as there was a call that I had already created during that time, then they would be able to join. If I had not created that yet, then they would get a message saying that call doesn't exist. And that works because we're all in the same domain, right? Everybody with an email address that ends in stpaul.k12.mn.us, right? We're all in the same Google Enterprise domain. So if I wanted to invite any guest speakers to my classes, I couldn't just give them the code and have them type in the code. I would have to send them the link for that particular call. Now let's talk about the experience of actually managing those classes. Number one, getting students to actually turn on their cameras during class. that was like pulling teeth. I decided that was not something that was going to be super important to me. Jamboard was a great tool. So Jamboard basically just like gives you a virtual whiteboard that everybody who is in the call can draw on all together. Students seemed to enjoy participating in those. At least they participated in those at much higher rates than most of the other things that I tried. Breakout rooms, also a very useful tool. And I really like how breakout rooms makes it very easy to like truly randomize small groups or pairs, instead of just like kind of, it's, when we're all in the classroom together, it's very easy to default to having students just gravitate towards the other students who are sitting near them. And yeah, I knew that because not all of my students were able to come to our classes, our live classes when they were scheduled, anytime that I had like a lesson or a lecture that I was giving in class, I made sure to record all of those, and then I would all of the teachers were encouraged, if they did have any recorded materials that they were going to give to their students, we were supposed to upload them to YouTube, because YouTube has automatic captioning, and for accessibility purposes, we're supposed to have everything captioned. And gosh, you think that a teacher's going to have enough time to like go back and manually write captions for a class like that? No way. So we relied heavily on the YouTube captioning system. Something that I was really surprised about and kind of am still distressed by is that there's quite a few students who, like, as soon as I have them unmute their mic to, make whatever comment, contribute to whatever discussion we're having, as soon as they're unmuted, I would hear a periodic chirp in the background of like their smoke alarm that has low batteries. And, I would point that out to those students like, hey, it sounds like your smoke alarm needs its battery changed. And they would be like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, can you hear the chirping? And they're like, no, I don't hear the chirping. So apparently there's a lot of families who just kind of let their smoke alarms sit around with low batteries, and they never change the batteries, and they've become so accustomed to the chirping that they can't hear it anymore. And I am very stressed on their behalf for that. Now, one thing that I definitely knew was going to be a challenge, or at least it wasn't going to happen naturally, is building a community, building relationships with these students, right? Because when we're all in a classroom together, there's just, there's naturally some amount of, chit chat that happens between me and the students, between students who are sitting near each other, et cetera, right? And also, like, just when we're walking around in the hallways, right? And students can hang out with each other for the 5 minutes in between classes. So I started looking around for like strategies for community building opportunities in virtual classrooms. And one thing that we did at Harding, kind of building wide, was during everybody's advisories, the students were asked to make a brief little slideshow about themselves so that they could share some stuff. All of the teachers also made slideshows about ourselves. So I've included a link to the slideshow that I made in the show notes. So go ahead and check that out if you like. But, beyond that, like that was just at the beginning of the semester. So I started looking for other ways that we could, have like Schoology discussions on a regular basis. Whenever it would make sense, especially for the content that we were talking about in the class, I would create a Schoology discussion and allow the students to put their thoughts about that thing into that discussion. This was particularly easy in my game design class because, like, students have opinions about games. I don't know if you've heard, but like, you ask students to give you an example of like a game that does balancing really well, and they will have all kinds of. Actually, if you ask them what games do not balance things well, they'll have a lot to say. But other things that are not even related to the content itself, right? Some like some weeks I could put up a prompt that's like, hey, post a picture of your pet in this, like I would create a slideshow, and then everybody would have their own slide within that slideshow, and everybody could like post a picture of their pet. We could just share some memes. We could, have like a pointless debate, right? Something that doesn't really matter, but we can still, debate it anyway, right? That kinds of thing. I would make an effort to create like little assignments that weren't really worth any points, but just gave the students an opportunity to kind of interact with each other. Unfortunately, in a pretty structured way, but because those were the only like points of contact that most of my students had with each other, I had to create those scenarios for them. Surveillance tools and proctoring. Oh man, this was a big topic that a lot of people were talking about this school year, and you know what? It's all BS. Don't do it. If you're a teacher and you are trying to ensure that your students are not cheating on a test or whatever, don't do it. There's no way to like equitably in a way that doesn't invade somebody's privacy as well. Like you just can't do it. You can't ensure that students are not going to be cheating on tests. So you know what? Don't give tests. Tests suck. Give the students a project, an activity that will demonstrate their mastery of whatever topic it is. Now, for me, it's easy for me to say that because my computer tech classes, right, like we're learning about a lot of technical skills, and then I can just give them a project like, hey, we're going to make a podcast episode now, and you have to demonstrate all of the things, the individual pieces that we went over in all of your formative activities. You're going to have to integrate those into the podcast episode that you're making. So yes, I acknowledge that it is pretty easy for me to stand up here and be like, no, tests are bad. For your math teachers and your science teachers and whatever, you're going to have to do a little bit of work to think about how you can measure a student's understanding of the concepts that you're giving them without a test. But I'm here to tell you that it can be done. So yeah, tests don't work so well in distance learning environments. Now, I'm 28 years old. I graduated 10 years ago, and something that I kept thinking about as we were doing this whole distance learning thing this last school year is if this pandemic had hit when I was in high school, so that would have been the 2007 to 2011 range, how would distance learning have gone in that, given the technology and the systems that we had in place at the time? What would have been like? So thinking about the tools, especially the digital tools that were available to us, Google Docs was a thing, but it wasn't very popular yet, and it was very, very basic. You could write papers, but it wasn't going to be anything fancy. I don't even remember if you could do like headers and footers yet. But that collaborative, like being able to edit a document at the same time as somebody else, and be able to see all of the changes that both of you were making, like that was a feature that was baked into Google Docs from the beginning. So really like the core of that collaborative tool was already in place. So that's really good. But just about everything else didn't exist yet, right? Dropbox. I remember Dropbox came out, I think, when I was like a junior in high school, and it was like revolutionary. Oh my gosh, like the cloud storage. What is that? I have a whole 2 gigabytes of storage like on somebody else's server that I can just upload anything I want. Amazing. Yeah, that's a pitiful amount of storage here in 2021. Also, I mean, even though I had a Dropbox account at the time, not everybody had Dropbox accounts, and there wasn't a the school district didn't have a system that they were already paying for everybody. So it wouldn't have been nearly as easy for students and staff to like collaborate on things and be able to share files with each other. Video conferencing, no way. We had one-on-one video calling in Skype, but group video calling wasn't really a thing yet, and certainly we didn't have any platforms that had the broad tool set that Zoom had of having one person who is like the host who can control what everybody else is able to do in the call. Video calling at that time was still just kind of envisioned as, oh yeah, you want to like call a few other family members or your friends. Like that's all that it was built for. Classroom CMSs, like Schoology, for example. That's the one that we use in SPPS. I think they probably existed. Moodle's been around for a long time, right? But they weren't really widely used, at least not in SPPS. We didn't have any. I remember that like my senior year of high school was the first time that one of my teachers allowed us to turn in an assignment via email, and it was due by midnight on a particular day. And that was my kind of like glimpse into the future of, oh, I should be able to just like work on whatever it is that I'm doing at whatever time is convenient for me at home. And I should be able to just turn it in, even if it's not like in class on that particular day. Why do I even need to use a printer? Like that was kind of an eye-opening experience for me. And now here I am as a teacher, and I'm just like, yeah, I mean, upload it to Schoology, whatever. I can't imagine from the teacher's perspective, if you wanted all of your students to turn everything in digitally, but we didn't have a centralized content management system like Schoology, that would have been a nightmare, because I would have had to be like kind of keeping track of emails, and I would have to like be sorting those into different folders probably to like, keep track of like which ones were turned in on time and which ones I had already graded and where were those grades. I would have had to like maintain my own spreadsheet probably. Like, what on earth? Yeah, no thank you. Also, I mean, just the fact that in 2010, my family still had dial-up at home. And so I imagine that, yeah, it was a much higher proportion probably of families that either didn't have internet or had very, very slow internet at home back in the late aughts. So that would have been a huge, huge challenge for making distance learning work at that time. So if you ask me, yeah, we were uniquely positioned here in the 2020 to 2021 school year for distance learning to really, really work well. And it was still a heck of a challenge. Now, something that I had learned about not too long before the pandemic hit, but ended up being a very useful way of conceptualizing my classes during distance learning is the flipped classroom model. So if you think about like the traditional class model, you've got a teacher, you've got a bunch of students in the room. The teacher lectures at the students, gives them all the information, right? Teaches them the stuff, and then they give homework, right? And so the homework is what reinforces, it's the interactive part of it, right? Where the students are engaging with that concept and putting it to work in whatever activities the teacher gave them, right? Now, flipped classroom model, the teacher gives the students like either video or audio lessons, right, for them to watch or listen to at home. And then when everybody's in the classroom together, then that's work time. And so the students are engaging with those concepts that hopefully they already watched at home. And they, the advantages of this system, especially when we're physically in a classroom together, is that because the work time is in the classroom, the students now have access to somebody who is an expert in that content area, right? If you think about the experience of asking your parents for help with your trigonometry homework, right? How many of your parents remember trig? Like, a lot of us think of ourselves as like, oh yeah, I'm pretty good at math, but like as soon as a student in grade school asks you for help, you realize, I don't remember what the Pythagorean theorem was. And so yeah, like it removes that frustrating aspect of trying to do that homework, because you can ask your teacher for help and they can help clarify things as you're working on it. And also it becomes kind of a more enjoyable experience. Like I've heard that a lot of parents enjoy like watching these lessons with their kids, because then that's a fun way for them to kind of share that experience and kind of get a little refresher on that topic, but without having to actually do the work. It's the student who has to do the work once they get to school. So yeah, this was a very useful thing for me to keep in mind when we were doing distance learning. Most of the lessons that I ended up giving were video tutorials that I gave to my students in our weekly folder, and I told them, okay, watch this, and then most of our in-class periods became either like class discussion time, which is something that you can only do when everybody's together, or it became just like quiet work time, and you unmute yourself and come to me if you need some help with whatever it is that you're working on. So yeah, like because 6 hours in a school building isn't the same as like 6 hours on video calls. So trying to make all of those video calls into like a 45-minute lecture, that's not a recipe for success for our students. So yeah, taking advantage of like what video calls excel at and getting rid of the stuff that they are not so good at is key to making this work. The flip side of this is that I guess that all of the teachers are video producers now, whether we like it or not. I mean, I guess so. For a lot of content areas, it's possible to find good quality video lessons about those particular topics. For something like me, where it's a little bit more of a niche topic, and I have I'm not as a computer tech teacher, I'm not teaching to state standards, right? The way that math or English or whatever are. So I ended up producing a lot of my own video tutorials, because then I could ensure that like, okay, everything that I want my students to know is going to be in this video, and there isn't going to be any extra stuff that they can ignore, right? So that has been kind of an adventure for me, is going from somebody who only ever thinks about producing audio to somebody who is now producing far more video than I ever wanted to in my life. But we're making it through. And because this whole flipped classroom model works well, both in distance learning, but also when we're all in person, I think I'm going to continue using it in future school years. And also, like, the fact that the video tutorials are much less confusing than like the written materials that I used to give my students. I think I'm going to take my video lessons that I produced over the last year and a half, and I'm going to spruce them up a little bit, and I will be releasing them publicly as video podcast feeds. So keep your eyes open for that. Those will be appearing on the Nexus.tv as like, a video podcast that you can download those videos directly and everything and use them however you want. I'll also be putting them up on our YouTube channel for anybody who is more inclined to use that platform. But yeah, I'll also I'll be announcing each of these series, because I'll have one for each of the different curricula that I run, right? There'll be one for like game design, there'll be one for podcasting, there'll be one for general computer tech stuff, there'll be one for programming. And so each of those, as I get around to publishing each of those publicly. I'll be putting up episodes here on the Extra Dimension, letting you know that those are now available. So stay subscribed to the Extra Dimension here if you want to hear about each of those when they do go live. And actually, this does have a little bit of an effect for the production cycle of the Extra Dimension itself. Before summer of 2020, we were fairly consistently coming out with an episode of the Extra Dimension once a month. Then we had like a 9-month hiatus here where I was focusing on distance learning. But now, since I'm going to be producing some, video podcast feeds, but those are going to be limited run. So while I'm working on those, I will be having to focus more heavily on those, and I won't have as much time to dedicate to the Extra Dimension. So the Extra Dimension will probably not be going back to a monthly schedule for the foreseeable future, at least. But I will be attempting, I've got a few episodes in mind that are very interesting, and I really want to make them, and I don't want it to take 5 years for me to make those episodes. So, these will be more occasional, probably won't be monthly, but, we shouldn't have another 9-month hiatus or anything like that for the Extra Dimension. Now, one major effect I think that this is going to have on our education system is that snow days are going to be a thing of the past. So starting in school year 2021 to 2022, SPPS has been authorized to transition into distance learning in the event of inclement weather, right? This didn't help for the last few days of 2020 to 2021, of course, where we had, because of the big heat wave here, SPPS decided that we weren't going to send students back into the buildings for the last few days of the school year, but also we weren't approved to go into distance learning. And so it became this kind of weird, teachers aren't allowed to give students any new work to do, but also it was only the last 3 days of school. So the teachers had already given the students all of the work that they wanted them to do. So it ended up being the same workload anyway. And that's honestly probably what snow days will become in the future is if I have already, as a teacher, if I have already created all of the assignments and I've put them up on Schoology and they are in the weekly folder, they've been available since Monday morning, right? If we end up having a snow day in the middle of that week, then it's not going to be the end of the world. My students don't have to stop working on that thing. It doesn't have to bump that assignment back by a day or two, because they can still work on that thing at home, no problem. And in that event, we might not even have, a live class, but I might, just hang out in office hours for the entire day or something like that, and my students would just be working on whatever assignments I had already given them. I know that not everybody is thrilled by this idea. CGP Grey had an entire video where he was labeling this.
This is a crime against childhood.
I mean, that's a little dramatic if you ask me. I don't think it's going to be the end of the world. Gray was comparing this to when I was a kid, and when a snow day was announced, we were all very excited. We could just go outside and play all the time. And I'm like, okay, but when I had snow days, what did I do? I just I did homework. I spent the day catching up on work that I needed to do for school. So it's not all that different, right? Or was that just me? Was I the only person who did homework during school days? I don't know. But I think that's definitely where we're headed in the future. Is we'll be able to at least not lose work time due to not being able to be in the building all the time. So, yeah, some final thoughts. I've been thinking about how school districts could take advantage of distance learning models, even if they didn't take the route of like creating an entire high school that is all online. I was thinking about what if we had, a few teachers who, like, particularly for content areas like mine, where, computer tech, not every student is taking, like, most of the students in the building are not taking computer tech class at any given time, right? And sometimes it is difficult to fill all of those classes. And also, like, across the district, if you've got like a very small school, like maybe Open World Learning, for example, right? They don't have any dedicated like computer tech or computer programming teachers there in that building. But what if we could consolidate the students from multiple different schools who all want to take a programming class? Maybe that class could be an online class, and so then those students, no matter what building they're in, right, they would just kind of go to a study hall to work on the materials for that class at that time, and then that teacher could be available to have office hours, or maybe they would have a live class if they can coordinate that between the different buildings. But I think that might be an interesting model, where you could have one teacher who has students from multiple different locations across the district. I think that might be a good way to leverage this distance learning expertise that we have now built up in our education system. Distance learning obviously is not the best scenario for everybody. There definitely were students who did well. I personally found, like, I thought that it was an environment that I, as a teacher, could thrive in. And now that I have gotten past the point where I, have had to create a bunch of video tutorials for all of my lessons, now that I already have that collection of video tutorials and I'm going to be releasing them as video podcasts, that's work that I'll be able to draw on in the future, whether I'm in a classroom physically or if I am doing distance learning. And so now that I've done that work, I think that I would like to continue doing distance learning. And as such, I was very, very excited when SPPS announced that they were going to have an online-only high school starting in the school year 2021 to 2022. And so I started keeping an eye on the job postings that SPPS was putting out, and when I saw that they had a computer tech position open for that online high school, I applied for it. I just sent that application in this morning, as of recording time. So hopefully next school year, I'll be continuing to work from home. I'll be working at this online high school. And like I'm sure that there'll be folks who will say, like, well, now like the students at Harding, right, are losing out on having a good computer tech teacher, and it may be very difficult for Harding to find a replacement, but it's probably going to be equally as difficult for like the online high school to find a computer tech teacher. We're in short supply right now. But also, like, I kind of feel like I owe it to the students who are in the online high school because they want to be, right? Because they have, like, you have to sign up for this school specifically. And so I want to make sure that those students are served by at least one teacher who, is enjoying this environment and is, I'm doing my best to serve them as well as I can in this distance learning environment. Not that, I'm not saying that like other teachers have been doing a bad job, but like if you've got a teacher who, thinks that, well, we'd all be better off just being in the classroom, then maybe they haven't tried out all of the different methods and tools that they could be using to make distance learning, a good experience. All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Extra Dimension. I have been your host, Ian R. Buck. You can find me on Twitter as Ian R. Buck. This episode is released under a Creative Commons Attribution license, so feel free to use any or all of it as you see fit, as long as you link back to the original page, which once again is thenexus.tv/TED56. If you would like to discuss this episode with other listeners, you can do so on our subreddit at reddit.com/r/thenexustv. And if you are willing and able to support us financially as we continue to make technology-focused podcasts, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/thenexustv. Come back for our next episode, which should be an episode all about how to make podcasts, and that is going to also kind of kick off the video tutorial lesson series about podcasting. So until next time, have a good one.
The Nexus
TV.
podcasts from the Technological Convergence.
We're presented with so many choices in our lives. How do we make sure we're making sound decisions? By getting a second opinion from an informed source, of course. Lucky for you, the hosts from across the Nexus use lots of hardware, software, and media, and analyze them on our show, Second Opinion. From reviewing the latest phones and laptops to pitting apps against each other, we've got you covered. Find us on our website, thenexus.tv, or by searching for Second Opinion reviews in your favorite podcast player.